Okay, if everyone please grab their seats, we'll make a start. Okay, welcome to session B of day 3 for the AVERT International Symposium, Contextual Influences on Radicalisation and Violent Extremism Pathways. We have 2 excellent presentations today. One presenter has unfortunately pulled out. If you're interested in that presentation, you can always contact him via email. The presentations, as a consequence, will be 25 minutes each, and we will have time for questions at the end. Timing will be reasonably strictly enforced, and to obviously maximise engagement in the back end. First presenter is Dr. Stephanie Scott-Smith from Macquarie University, talking about Salafi-Jihadist mobilisation. Thank you.
Hi guys, thank you so much for coming to listen to me talk about this. This was my PhD project, and my interest in this area came from my work actually initially as a practitioner. So I'm a forensic psychologist, and at the time this project started, I was managing the PRISM team, which is New South Wales Disengagement Service within corrective services. So at the time we were sort of thinking about getting a structure together and how we needed to prioritise the work we were doing, how we needed to provide these interventions. And the first thing you do as a team leader is you go back to the literature and you try to find information that's evidence-based that you can use to help inform your decision-making. So the question that I had with my PhD sort of came out of a difficulty finding clear answers. So I'll take you through exactly what I've spent the last 4 and a bit years doing, and sort of some of the recommendations I made for CVE. So the project responds to a significant amount of debate around this topic of citizenship revocation that is within the literature. It's obviously at the moment within Australia being used as a CT strategy, and the gap that I found within what we know about this space is that obviously it's targeting the Salafi-Jihadist inspired offenders, but we don't know how people like the foreign terrorist fighters that have gone overseas to engage in these conflicts, we don't know how these themes are made sense within the ideology that is linked to that group. So someone here on the slide like Shamima Begum, who has obviously come up and is quite high profile, linked to this sort of legislation, is someone who basically went over when she was 15 and joined the Islamic State. And then more recently, 2023, she was her appeal was rejected against the revocation of her British citizenship. So this effectively prohibits her from entering the UK. And I know that the Begum's lawyers are currently appealing that decision as well. So along with the ability to cancel passports and prohibit travel and stuff like that, citizenship status has been instrumental in the way that governments seek to control movement and also risk. So a lot of the potential risk was posed to then the home countries that these terrorist fighters have come from. So several countries have used this legislation: Belgium, Norway, Turkey, Australia, UK, France, Canada, Denmark, and the Netherlands and Switzerland as well have adopted it for different periods of time, some still currently. And it can impact people who are suspected of terrorism-related behaviour and that haven't necessarily had a criminal conviction. And also, some have argued within the literature that it can also be applied even if a person may become stateless as a result of having their citizenship revoked. So statelessness, in terms of the international legal definition, is a person who is not considered as a national by any state under the operation of its law. So the research question that I wanted to answer was, how have these themes been used in the mobilisation process for Salafi-Jihadist groups? And again, it came from working in the prisons and having to respond to this sort of dynamic threat landscape and this sort of moving legislation and this arguments around hyper legislation that we're seeing in relation to this CT strategy. So very briefly, this is how I did it. So ultimately, what I'll be focusing on is just the case studies, because that's the most interesting part. So I looked at 4 ideologues who were highly influential, and was really trying to unpick why what they were saying led to mobilisation and was so influential, but also how, if these themes were being used to mobilise, how were they being used and how were they likely to be effective? What about the use was linked to the broader arguments of these groups that actually made it lead to actual action? So these were the 4 ideologues that were chosen. They span a period of time from the sort of 70s, 80s, the Soviet war, Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and the war that led from that, right through to 2019 when Baghdadi was killed. So we've got Azam there, Al-Awlaki, Naji, but that was the Management of Savagery, which is a strategic jihadist manual, and then Baghdadi speeches. So it was recordings from YouTube that was still open source and publicly available. Books, Azam wrote lots of books, the leaflets that was still available and being circulated. Management of Savagery's been found on lots of convicted terrorist offenders as part of their, when they've been searched and raided, this manual's still floating around. It's quite easily able to be located online. And Al-Awlaki's the same. He made lots and lots of audio recordings, which you can still find. So they were all English translations, obviously, of Arabic texts, aside from Al-Awlaki, who recorded a lot in English, which was also part of his appeal. He was living in the US and was a US citizen. So, to answer the research question, I used thematic analysis of all those sources and I looked at the emergent themes. The social mobilisation I won't go into in too much depth, but basically it's a tool to identify the mobilising strategies in these narratives and how they led to collective action. And I also created thematic networks, which I'll go through and show you all, which is just a really nice, clear, easy way to capture the main ways that these ideologues are constructing their narratives. So just very briefly, this will come in handy a little bit later, but these are the principles of social mobilisation theory. The only thing really to know about this is that the theory has been used to conceptualise the strategies that prompt people to perform behaviours that are individually costly and provide negligible individual or social benefits, but are meaningful when performed by a large number of individuals. So there are, sometimes hurdles that people need to overcome and sacrifices they need to make to engage in whatever behaviour is being demanded of them. And it's also likely not going to benefit them individually unless a whole bunch of people do the same thing. So it fits with some of the thinking of the foreign terrorist fighters who are sometimes leaving behind their families and their jobs and careers and stuff, all their social network to sort of go overseas to a place they may never have been and engage in a conflict where the cost could be their lives. They argue, so this reading particularly argues that and provides really nice clear definitions for each of these principles. And it just sort of gives you a evidence-based way of trying to sort of garner how themes could lead to actual action. So this is what my data sets look like. This is in vivo for those of you that aren't familiar, and it's just a really nice, transparent way of organising your qualitative data, and then your coding by line or however you'd like to. You've got the set of text down the side there, and then down the other side you've got the themes, and you can label them however you like. More than happy to share the data sets and anything if that's helpful for you guys at any stage. But it's also transparent, so you can go through and, you know, argue about the way particular lines have been coded, and have conversations about it, and sort of make sure that your line of thinking around how you've coded something is transparent. So the thematic networks are web-like illustrations to summarize the main themes that constitute a piece of text. So I used, this is not my idea by any stretch, it's Attridge Sterling 2001 paper, which I'll provide the QR code to, has designed this format. And it's really useful for trying to convey what are quite complex narratives. So this is a quick snapshot of what Azam's texts look like, and the QR code there will lead you to a paper if you'd like some more sources and details about his analysis. But you can see that the big things are just to note that there's your basic, your organising, and your global themes. So for Azam, you can see that the four organising themes, which are the circles, Azam provides both religious authority and battlefield credibility. Therefore, his narrative is aimed at ensuring the whole of the Muslim Ummah achieve taqwa, which is piety, because Islam is currently under attack, requiring defensive jihad, justifying defensive jihad as obligatory, and the conditions have been met for that. And that building an Islamic state will serve in the survival and propagation of true Islam. And he is the source of what that true Islam is. The key there is that without a state, Islam remains vulnerable, and there's strong emphasis on his status and credibility as a religious authority. So for him, religion wasn't used as a sort of abstract motivation. His narratives, it's very intertwined with the context of the Cold War era and the history of Islam. And so he was focused as well as sort of using the impact on the Middle East in his narratives to justify violence. Then linking it then to, okay, that's great, but how do we know it's actually mobilising people? This is where the social mobilisation theory principles come into play. So this is a way to sort of go, well, are the themes and are what he's saying reflective in these definitions that Rogers, Goldstein and Fox were using? There seems to be evidence that, yes, it's there quite consistently throughout his narrative. So this is just a bit of a snapshot of how they have come up for him. So yeah, it was an interesting finding. The only thing though is, given the evidence that led to social mobilisation theory's construction, that he uses religious miracles a lot to inspire people within his narratives. That's not captured and not really reflected in these definitions used by within social mobilisation theory. It's not surprising, given that's very rationalistic sort of theory, but it is interesting if SMT is going to be used in this space to note that that's a gap. This is Awaki's. So again, in terms of thinking about citizenship, revocation and statelessness, they seem to come through as a very, very clear argument about the need to recognise the value and importance of the collective Muslim identity, and to make lots and lots of undermining of citizenship as an illegitimate concept that has no relevance for true Muslims. So Islam's providing everything needed to run a functioning state, which should be built, and Islam is currently under attack. All we need to do is look at the occupation of Muslim lands, for which there's ample evidence. This is the management of savagery. So statelessness and citizenship feed into this idea again of collective Muslim identity, and the manual itself was published in 2004. We know it was influential because, as I said before, it's been found on and in possession of quite a few convicted terrorist offenders around the world. So it's still out there and it's still being used in different capacities. Baghdadi was the most interesting one in terms of the themes of statelessness and citizenship revocation that I was interested in. So again, we see this focus on collective Muslim identity in terms of this idea of statelessness filtering through in his narratives. With citizenship revocation, it came through a lot very directly as Islam being under attack, as evidence for Islam being under attack. So in a nutshell, Baghdadi argued that Muslims need to be provided with a safe homeland so they no longer face expulsion or oppression due to their religion. And he emphasizes that the use of the term terrorism in Western rhetoric omits the atrocities faced by Muslims, particularly in Palestine. And this is also something that was reflected in Azam's narrative a lot, him being Palestinian and spending most of his life in exile. So these themes are really directly discussed within Baghdadi's narrative. He talks about the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which he argues established false borders onto land to oppress Muslims. And to Baghdadi, Muslims are victimized by being made stateless because non-believers continue to remove them from their land. So citizenship is a tool of oppression to Baghdadi, and that's what he argues. Citizenship's not used to protect Muslim citizens in the same way as it's used to protect non-believers, and that's regardless of if you live in a Western country or within a Muslim majority country. So I'll just quickly read you one excerpt from his message to the Mujahideen and Ummah. So he says, "Those rulers continue striving to enslave the Muslims, pulling them away from their religion with those slogans. So either the Muslim pulls away from his religion, disbelieves in Allah, and disgracefully submits to the man-made laws of the East and West, living despicably and disgracefully as a follower by repeating those slogans without will and honor, or he lives persecuted, targeted, and expelled, and ends up being killed, imprisoned, or terribly tortured on the accusation of terrorism." So in a nutshell, the key findings were that citizenship revocation and statelessness do contribute to building two core mobilizing strategies, which are reflected within that SMT theory. So by emphasizing the collective Muslim identity as the only valid, legitimate, important identity that a person should have, and that Islam is under attack, and providing evidence for that, and fostering that grievance. So what? So why is this helpful? Why do we need to know this? What does it actually mean? And that's a question that, going to the literature as a practitioner, you often ask yourself. So I really wanted to try very, very hard to draw as much from what we figured out there as possible to make it applicable within practice. So the things that I recommended were that there's a need for further research to understand how terrorist groups respond to government policy within their narratives, particularly CT policy, because they do respond to it. And it's important for us to understand that because it can unintentionally form part of the mobilising narrative. So something like AVERT is so fantastic because it gives us the opportunity for policymakers and academics to come together and further collaborate in ways to figure out ways to avoid these issues. The use of citizenship revocation as a counter-terrorism tool should be considered in P and CVE program and service evaluations to better understand its impact on primary, secondary and tertiary levels of service. So how does this policy feature in social cohesion or in work with those considered at risk of radicalisation or in the tertiary sort of disengagement work that's happening in the jails? How does that come through? How do we, as practitioners, think about this and conceptualise it within the way we structure our sessions, within the ways we think about structured professional judgment, risk assessment, because a lot of that comes down to what you know and what you know about the context that you're working in. So it's really important to think about. If it's considered in the evaluations, there's a way for us to objectively think about it and problem solve around it and think about continuing professional development of staff that are working within these spaces as well. The P&CVE services and programs should have a strategy in place to equip staff in understanding the counter-terrorism policy context that they're working in. So that can be at the state and territory level, at the national level, but also then where Australia sits more globally. And it's important because the findings from this study, for example, demonstrate that government policy such as citizenship revocation can be used to mobilise ideological support, and CVE staff may need to respond to the messaging in some way, shape or form. So there is a need to fill that gap or at least have some way of accessing credible sources of information that are useful for practitioners at that level in terms of the day-to-day work that they're doing at the coalface. And then the principles and strategies of social mobilisation theory also seem to be useful as a tool to enhance counter-narrative effectiveness, or at least to think about in terms of constructing CT messaging. And based on the findings, there's utility in developing messaging that celebrates dual citizenship and that promotes the coexistence of different aspects of an individual's identity. So bringing it away from, and it's a lot of the similar work we would do in sessions, bringing it away from very black and white polarized thinking into more shades of grey, that they can coexist and that different aspects of an individual's identity can include cultural and religious differences. And then finally, they're identifying how a person's collective and religious identity and national identity can coexist, because again, throughout the propaganda, there's no coexisting of anything. It's all very black and white. So when we're thinking about utilising connections in community as CVE practitioners, a lot of all the work that we do is individualised, it's tailored, it's about the person. And so within disengagement, there would be real benefit in having some way to explore collective identity, because this is obviously, these themes are coming up a lot and reinforcing the need to prioritise that. So how do CV services become more embedded within local supports to foster this? And ultimately, it's about speaking about how we build meaningful belonging and a sense of connection, which, as we heard in Momo and Roman's talk, is the essence of the pro-integration model, which is used in New South Wales and Victoria as well. So any way we can do that is incredibly beneficial. And that was what I spent the last 4 years looking at. And yeah, thank you very much, guys, for listening. I hope you enjoyed it.
Thank you, Dr. Scott Smith. Where can we locate and identify your work? Where can we have a good look at it?
This QR code, if you scan it, links to a publication on Azam specifically, but I'm more than happy to be emailed, and I can send you guys my data set, or there's another paper coming. I can send that to you when it's finally published. And anything else I can send you, I'm more than happy to, if you just shoot me an email. But that code at least has the reference list if you're interested to access the sources that I used.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm sure there'll be a lot of food for thought and discussion from that presentation. Our next presenters, Paul Schmidt and Dr. Serge Loode from Multicultural Queensland, talking about the changing dynamics of cold community engagement, CV, social cohesion and practitioner views. Next.
Good. Good morning, everyone. It's interesting to get up to do a presentation when you're still digesting what you've just heard. It'll be interesting in the questions at the end for us to look at, some of those crossovers that are really interesting about narratives and counter-narratives and collective identity. As I've just introduced, I'm the manager of community engagement at Multicultural Affairs Queensland. Our work is focused more in the social cohesion space. And so I think the presenter yesterday, the plenary session, talked about being in that upstream area where drivers are heading people into that violent extremism space. So although I do have an academic background, I'm here as a practitioner, and I've brought my very own academic along with me today. Serge, do you want to introduce yourself to everyone?
Thank you very much for having me. My name is Serge Loode, and I do work at the University of Queensland, but I'm also a director of Peace and Conflict Studies Institute Australia. We're a NGO based in Meange in Brisbane, and work in the multicultural space, but also in international peace building. My background is in mediation and conflict resolution. I'm most of the time a practitioner, a trainer, a mediator with the Department of Justice in Queensland, but for probably about 20 years now, we've worked often hand in hand with local and state government on social cohesion projects, bringing together different community groups, for example, First Nations elders and elders of migrant and refugee communities, and in general, working to establish more well-connected communities that have the resilience and diversity to deal with conflict, and also, I suppose, to prevent their own members from drifting into violent extremism. Over to you, Paul.
Thanks, Serge. So in terms of where this topic came from, for us, it's really growing out of our work and what we've experienced over the last couple of years. We've had an engagement program since soon after 9/11, a single officer working with communities across Queensland, and then his time tended to be triaged when we have some sort of responsive incident that comes up, whether that's within community or from the broader community sort of impacting in. And so really what we're doing today is inviting you into a bit of a conversation / debate that I've been having with Serge over this year as our work became more complex, especially last year. Some of you will know about things like the Khalistan issue. Then we had obviously the war in re-escalation of conflict in Gaza, Israel. And then we've had some domestic incidents as well. And at each one of those stages, our work became more complex, and we realised that we needed to really reflect on who are the other people operating in the space, that our space was expanding perhaps into other people's specialities, and that we might need to bring on some new skills into our work as well. So I'm keen, we might have time at the end. I know a lot of you are working more in what we sort of envisaged in the consultation we did as core programs. So I guess we're sitting in a particular space and seeing your area coming out towards us. And I'm really interested in your views, how you might see, we've had a bit of a discussion about CVE and what does it mean to work in that space and intersect with other practitioners. So unsurprisingly, our main finding from some consultation that we did with other practitioners was that people's work was becoming more connected over the last few years, becoming more complex, pressured in different directions, but the pressures were felt differently across a few different spaces. Disappointing for me, but completely true. Anything I say here does not make Queensland government policy. Just a quick disclaimer there. And just in terms of our approach, we are focused on multicultural communities, so culturally, linguistically diverse communities. So when we're talking about people at risk, we're seeing them as partially or recently embedded within those community settings, and then there's a broader social system around them. In terms of our data set, as I said, it's growing out of our experience and our work, and we had some in-depth interviews with 15 different practitioners across Queensland, different levels of government, different, I guess, sectoral focus, and a couple of non-government practitioners as well. Using a snowballing approach, we got some referrals from our central agency and then worked out from there as we went along. So really what we're doing is presenting some of the high-level themes from those discussions that came out, and Serge will be sort of reflecting on some of the research and areas of theory that might shine some work on that, and that's how our discussions have gone over the last year as we try to think about how do we work as, in some ways, a generalist agency with some very specific needs that are beginning to emerge. So in terms of the general shift that, well, a little bit about Queensland first. And I know there are a few people from Queensland in the room. Our communities are a little bit smaller than it's sitting here in Melbourne or in Sydney. A lot of our leaders might know each other, and when they did the recent framework review, they picked up that different to a lot of places in Australia, there's a high level of attendance at different community events by leaders from other cultures. So we have that interconnectedness. We also have quite frequent natural disasters, which means we go through this recovery response sort of process, response recovery sort of process a lot. And even during COVID, we were lucky enough to have, I guess, COVID come into the state, and then we managed to eradicate that a few times. And so I would argue that this is a good case to look at for opportunities for that sort of network and institutional learning. Any researchers or funders out there that want to come and look a bit more closely, please come and talk to us afterwards. But in terms of the general shift, a lot of you would have heard this before, and other speakers have mentioned that over the last, especially 2023 post-COVID, we've seen the rise of geopolitical conflicts, and then people talking about, well, they're very distant, but they're socially close. They're right here in our communities. They're impacting people. In terms of those three groups down the side, that was, it's sort of an artifact of our sampling that we had people that are more involved in the core programs of working in CVT, CT. We had people such as ourselves that are more engagement focused. So if you like, upstream focused of the CV space. And then we had these partner agencies that end up involved because of whole of government approaches, case conferencing, things like that. So it was really interesting to see their different perspectives on what's happened. you'll be very familiar with the way core programs have seen things, that sort of reduction in age in terms of demographics of people of concern, people in their programs, and then the intersection as the age drops with mental health and child development. How do we understand, how do we separate what's going on there? So they're the sort of themes that people in that space shared with us. In terms of the engagement space, there's obviously the political element around some of the conflicts that we had, anger in parts of communities. And then combined with that, the grief and trauma of people impacted directly or indirectly. So I know there was a topic happening, I think, next door now on trauma, which I'm going to look at the recording of later, that practitioners started saying there's all these new skill sets around conflict resolution, around trauma-informed approaches that we just didn't need to know before. And as people, particularly those based in government, so easy for us to get it wrong as we seek to engage and support communities and actually cause some of the issues that we're trying to ameliorate. It's important to also say that although we're focused on issues, the incredible strength and resilience of communities and the work that they do, and we'll come back to that a bit later, but that communities, we're working from the perspective that communities are actually very strong, very resilient, and they're dealing with these sort of pressures in that context. Partner agencies, and I wasn't expecting this, when we asked them about social cohesion and we were thinking they'd talk about similar dynamics, they said, well, for us, it's actually the housing and cost of living crisis that when it comes to supporting families, these are the massive stresses that are on them. When it comes to feeling of safety and belonging for new and arrived communities, for migrants, the cost of living and housing was the main pressure. And then the wait times to get people onto mental health programs and all of those things. So there was this, I guess, from different perspectives, this picture of everyone's work, different pressures all becoming connected. And that's exactly how someone summed it up, that everything became connected to everything else and all our work also became connected. Over to you, Serge.
Okay, thank you very much, Paul. So when Paul and I started this conversation and he was describing the dynamics that his research discovered, I said, look, to me, this very much resonates with my own PhD research, which was on complex adaptive systems, conflict, racism, and social change. And I try to very briefly present some of the theory that I think helps understand some of the dynamics that we're dealing with a little bit. So the metaphor you see there, and anyone who's looked at complex systems is probably familiar with it, is a starling murmuration. So it's a nature metaphor, and starlings in particular in Europe, I'm originally from Germany, make these wonderful patterns in the air. But there is never a lead bird. There is no leading animal that prescribes the pattern. The patterns develop out of the interactions of the different birds with each other. And even though one could conceive that as completely chaotic, they actually create particular dynamic attractors and patterns. So this is the kind of lens that I suggest to utilize to actually view the situation that we're encountering on the ground. And in particular, this complete connection of domestic and international events, of service overload, of lack of capacity, of also sometimes government interventions. And I think Stephanie's presentation actually has spoken to that really well. The idea of citizenship revocation, for example, what's the systemic effect of that? So very briefly, in terms of theory, what I suggest to use is the theory of social emergence by Keith Sawyer. And he talks about that structural patterns and social systems are caused by the complex configurations of many people engaged in overlapping and interlocking patterns or relationships with one another. These patterns arise out of the myriad number of past and present interactions between people which influence future behavior. British community development academic Alison Gilchrist talks about when she defines communities, she uses a non-functional definition that is about communities being or consisting of interpersonal connections, fluid networks, and small-scale self-help groups and organizations. And in these sort of complex systems, the components interact in densely connected networks. Global systems functions cannot be localized to any one subset of individuals or groups, but rather are distributed throughout the entire system. The overall system cannot be decomposed into subsystems and these into smaller subsystems. So a reductionist, very common approach in social and natural sciences doesn't really work to describe and understand system effects. And the components interact with each other using a complex and sophisticated language, exactly what people do. Just an anecdotal example of that is something that I'm experiencing since my PhD research, where I've engaged with people from many different cultural communities around topics of belonging, racism, and also to some degree radicalization. I still maintain a lot of relationships with some of the communities, and for example, I regularly receive messages from a former participant, whom I would consider a friend now, from the Rohingya community in Queensland, who describes their desperation over the conflict in Gaza, over the conflict in Lebanon, over the treatment of Muslims, and very easily then also connects that with their own history of statelessness, of persecution, and of trouble. So I feel there is a community that is quite strongly affected by these global events in quite a different place, and they connect that to their own history of suffering and trauma. And I can, over time, over the last couple of years, some of this messaging has become more desperate. So I'm not saying in any way that the people that I know and work with are drifting towards violent extremism, but I think the patterns that Paul has described are absolutely manifesting themselves in the experience of people who work in this space. Now, if we can go to the next slide. For me, I'm a conflict resolution practitioner. So for me, it's about, well, what happens if people clash with each other, if there are violent incidents, what can be done in these extremely complex situations. So I use the work of Peter Coleman from Columbia University, who's done a lot of work on intractable and protracted conflicts in the world, whether they be domestic or international. And we've applied some of that thinking to complex social cohesion dynamics. So first of all, Coleman argues that we need to differentiate between conflict situations that can be managed and those that are intractable and complex. And fortunately, according to his research, only about 5% of conflicts are in that intractable and protracted state. But they are the ones that escalate, that are unpredictable, that lead in particular to extreme violence. The problems that underlie them often have a long history, so they're not new. They have been passed on through generations. The dynamics are increasingly difficult to understand, but seem to be incredibly simple. So I think this is where, for example, narratives of monolithic identity, Stephanie has described some of them, and has researched some of them, and how they always depict the individual or the particular community as the sufferer, as being under siege and under attack. Out of that, pain and demands of the here and now focus people on responding to that crisis. So they often respond with short-term problem-oriented thinking and are unable to actually respond to the complexity. So this is also something that we need to understand. The problems that we're dealing with have been there for a long time. So it's probably almost a little bit ludicrous to think that short-term interventions for over a year or 2 or 3 years might be able to make a quick difference. So out of that, I've got sort of 4 key learnings to deal with situations like that, and they are for me to accept that interactions and effects are non-linear. So putting a program in place doesn't actually mean that it's going to achieve its aim. Because if we're dealing with such a complex situation, it is unpredictable to use, and using a linear framework for thinking and design doesn't really work. Also, complex system scholars have consistently critiqued the issue of hierarchical institutions. Most government services are quite hierarchical, and they're often ill-suited to perform complex tasks because decision-making is ultimately delegated to a small group of individuals or even to a single individual. We see that in international development and peace-building efforts, where the bigger the program, the more difficult the intervention, the higher it goes up the chain, so the fewer people ultimately actually make decisions, and the more they are removed from the ground where the problem occurs and where the communities are that we're trying to work with. We haven't found a way to plan peaceful societies or organizations. If we look at our own societies, our own workplaces, our own institutions, I think we see that there is a lot of fault, a lot of problems, but nonetheless, we often utilize these as templates to design programs to make a difference. And I think that's to some degree not very helpful. It's about starting with a blank slate and working with the communities that are affected and bringing them in as partners in the design of programs. The last point is again from Peter Coleman, who talks about dynamic attractors and violence as stability. So systems effects tell us that sometimes there are such strong positive feedback loops that reinforce particular behaviors in people and reinforce these monolithic identities that what that does is it drags the system towards this particular attractor. And if that attractor is violence, is for example a jihadist narrative or so, then that becomes the status quo. So that becomes the normal, and trying to change that is much more difficult than when these positive feedback loops are weaker. So I'll hand back to Paul, going back to the research and trying to make sense of what that looks like in practice.
Thanks, Serge. Of course, the practitioners we talked to didn't say that we were sitting, we sat around and thought about this complex system and how do we respond to it. They just got to the work and, of course, very reactive, very responsive. By the way, Serge, we have 5 minutes, okay?
Yep.
So in terms of, I won't go down into the detail of it, but what we saw was a whole range of spaces that were bringing people from different disciplines together that just emerged, some of it in the youth space, with the emergence of new tools to identify serious repeat offenders. A lot of agencies realised they were working with exactly the same set of people. There's been some legislative changes that have helped those agencies now work together and sequence their work in a much more coordinated way. We've seen a lot more check-ins between agencies. So we might be going out to engage with a particular cohort, and then we might check in with law enforcement or some others. Is there anything that you want us to be aware of as we're doing that work so that we can align some of our priorities and interests that way? We've seen some emerging new referral pathways, especially great if everyone's talking about engaging with schools. Anyone who has tried to engage with schools before, you know that they feel bombarded by everyone sees schools as the solution. So some really great tools and I know that there are agencies here that are running training and trying to get referral pathways in place too, so that teachers can see that we can be part of the solution for them, not more work on their plate. And I'll skip over some of the other work so that we can get to our last couple of slides, Serge.
Okay. I'll try to be very brief here. So what are some of the recommendations from the research literature? So it's about using the system's effects. So it's not about specifically individual interventions. It's about interacting with the system in different places and creating connections that weren't there before. Stephanie has talked about this idea of celebrating dual citizenship, for example. That's what Coleman would talk about as a hopeful story of change, while simultaneously discouraging positive conflict-enhancing feedback loops. This work is about people, and it's about how they feel and the relationships that they have. So I think interveners need to become much better at working with emotions and with relationships. That's often more important than factual data. The work tells us that often it's very difficult to talk with someone who is already very far down the track of these sort of monolithic ideas. So trying to convince them to change, it's much harder than working with latent networks of effective actions. So using snowballing techniques and weak power and negotiation chains to actually engage with people who are not as far down the rabbit hole, but and to discuss with them, and then they discuss with others in their communities, and these sort of ultimately come to the people who are more extremists. So what all of this does is it increases multidimensionality. It's about weakening the positive conflict-enhancing feedback loops and strengthening negative feedback loops that help people to have more nuanced understandings. This is the idea around collective identities, finding out that groups aren't actually just of one opinion, but there's often different views within the group, and nurturing that through positive interactions and dialogue. So it's about creating diversity and resilience, and to create more connectedness and engagement. Paul, over to you.
Thank you. So again, just covering across the top of the themes here. This is framed in a very positive way, this slide, about what stakeholders said, what practitioners said about what's needed for success to move forward. There's obviously, we group them into these three categories, but each one of these has, it wasn't always presented positively. Sometimes it was presented as this is a key challenge and we don't know exactly how to do this. So as Serge said, it's difficult for large organisations, for government to stay in that complex space. So there was a huge theme around we have to keep sharing info, we have to collaborate, we have to respond in very tailored ways. But how do we do that without getting focused on becoming more efficient? As we scale up, it might become formulaic. There wasn't great answers on that. That's one of our challenges. This idea of non-judgmental approaches, and it's been expressed by many people over the last few days. We need to work with people with empathy. We need to show trust. But how do we do that for some practitioners that have even been traumatised themselves or seen some of the darker side of what can happen in this space? How do we keep that sort of empathy and trust, and when we're working with ideology, the understanding that it all makes sense from the inside? And I think that was presenting some of you in the session around far right, that they see that they're doing the right thing. It's not the same as necessarily other sets of offences where people underneath it all might go, well, yeah, actually, it's not the right thing. And then finally, this last one, the general feeling, and I think CV people have talked a little bit about this as well, is how do we get this work valued? That when you're avoiding impacts, how do you measure that? How do you get it valued? For us in community engagement, it's also showing the technical skill set that's needed, that it's not just, people said this a few times, we're not just sitting around having cups of coffee with people, but there's a lot more to engagement than that. There's technical skills that are needed, and there's even a certain type of personality. Not everyone is suited to it. And people sometimes felt like superiors in their organisation either didn't understand or didn't value it. So this is part of where this topic's come from for us as well, is we know that as we look at national strategies, where are we going to go forward with things like CVE, there's interest in increased community engagement. And I think that's a great thing, but we need to understand what does that actually mean in practice, and what sort of disciplines do we need to learn from in order to do it. I'm waiting for another sign. I will finish up. I've made Serge be a theorist today, but he's actually a very skilled practitioner and negotiator. He's run a whole range of processes with people around how do you sit in that complexity space and work with communities. You might be able to chip something in the questions, Serge, I'm not sure, but I encourage you to speak with him if you want to know more about some of the work that he's done over many years in Brisbane and also internationally. And just to sort of finish going forward on that very last point, it shouldn't say better, it should say stronger appreciation of the work done in community. That when we talk to community and people based outside of government, they say, what you guys do is great, but at the end of the 9 to 5 day, at the end of the working week, you go home, and community, from their perspective, does the bulk of the work. So they want to know how we're going to support them in the work that they're doing and strengthen it from that perspective. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Paul and Serge. Very, very interesting. Just before we start the panel, where can we locate the precise work that you're doing together?
So we don't have a written paper on this, so like a lot of practitioner stuff that's happening on the run.
Yep.
So you can email us and we'll discuss with you. Serge has written up a number of things, so I've got his email. Thank you. His email is on the last slide, and I'm not sure if the slides get shared. Yeah, that'd be great. So in terms of that complexity theory and